Stillwater, Texas, was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. A town of just over 2,000 people, it was defined by its small diners, single traffic light, and the looming white steeple of Grace Fellowship Church at the town center. Folks knew each other by name, waved to strangers, and exchanged gossip over steaming cups of black coffee at Cindy's Diner every morning. It was a town untouched by the chaos of the larger cities. That is, until the gunshots rang out. On a chilly Wednesday evening, November 18th, a 911 call shattered Stillwater's quiet routine. The dispatcher's voice crackled with tension as she relayed the report to the sheriff's department. Shots fired at the Moore residence, the preacher's home. Deputy Sheriff Blake Larson was the first to arrive. Larson was a grizzled man in his late 40s, well-respected but slightly bitter after a long divorce. He parked his cruiser just past the white picket fence surrounding the Moore home. As he approached, the glow of the porch light revealed something he'd never forget. Pastor Philip Moore, the town's beloved preacher, lay motionless in a pool of blood on the porch steps. A single gunshot wound to his chest had silenced the man who once inspired so many. Inside the house, the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Shouts and sobs echoed from the living room. "Stay back!" a woman's voice screamed, trembling and frantic. It was Linda Moore, Philip's wife of 17 years. She stood barefoot in the middle of the living room, clutching a smoking revolver in her hand. Larson moved cautiously. "Linda, put the gun down," he ordered, his own weapon drawn. Linda's eyes darted around the room. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks. Her face was pale, and she seemed frozen, teetering between hysteria and collapse. "They betrayed me," she whispered hoarsely. "All of them." The living room was a wreck. A vase lay shattered near the fireplace. Blood splattered the cream-colored carpet, and the body of their 15-year-old daughter, Grace, was crumpled near the kitchen doorway. The teenager's lifeless body had been riddled with 2 gunshot wounds, one to her chest and one to her abdomen. Another scream pierced the air, coming from the far side of the house. Larson followed the sound into the hallway and found a young man slumped against the wall. It was David Moore, the preacher's 18-year-old son. He was alive but clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "I didn't do anything," David cried out, his voice cracking. "I swear I didn't." Paramedics arrived shortly after, taking David away in an ambulance. Linda was placed under arrest without further resistance. She had dropped the revolver and sat numbly on the front steps as Larson handcuffed her. "They deserved it," she mumbled repeatedly. "They deserved it." By the time the sun rose over Stillwater, the shocking details of the Moore family tragedy spread like wildfire. The local papers called it the preacher's nightmare, and whispers about infidelity, betrayal, and murder filled the pews of Grace Fellowship Church. But for seasoned homicide investigator Detective Claire Whitman, this wasn't just another small-town murder. Something about the scene didn't add up. It wasn't just the sheer violence of the act or the shocking involvement of a preacher's family. It was the unspoken stories in the wreckage of that house, the overturned furniture, the silent screams etched into the bloodied walls, and the cold, distant look in Linda's eyes. Whitman, a former Houston detective with a reputation for solving cases others couldn't, arrived in Stillwater 3 days later. Tall, sharp-eyed, and unflinchingly determined, she stepped into the Moore residence for the first time and immediately felt the weight of the tragedy. The air was heavy, as if the house itself carried the burden of its secrets. Detective Claire Whitman stood on the front porch of the Moore residence, scanning the scene before stepping inside. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that lingers after something unspeakable. She noted the splintered wooden door frame, the bloodstains on the porch steps where Philip Moore had fallen, and the cracked windows near the living room. A deputy greeted her inside, his face pale. "Detective Whitman, it's not like anything I've seen before." He handed her the preliminary incident report. Whitman didn't respond immediately. She liked to absorb the scene first, let the details settle in her mind like puzzle pieces waiting to be connected. Her sharp green eyes moved over the chaotic living room. Blood smeared the beige carpet, shattered porcelain lay scattered across the floor, and framed family photos hung crookedly on the walls. The Moores had once been the picture of a wholesome, small-town family. Now they were the center of a murder investigation. Whitman crouched near the body outline of Grace Moore, the 15-year-old daughter. Her photo had been in the file, a shy, sweet girl with a freckled face and a warm smile. Now that warmth was gone. Whitman noticed something odd near Grace's body, an overturned dining chair. It was angled strangely, as if knocked over in a scuffle. Next to it was a stuffed bear, one of Grace's belongings. She was shot twice, Whitman said aloud, more to herself than anyone else. Once in the chest, once in the stomach. The mother said she deserved it. That's what Linda Moore keeps repeating, the deputy replied uneasily. Whitman nodded and rose to her feet. And the son? David Moore, 18 years old. He's alive, grazed by a bullet in the shoulder. He says he tried to stop her when she snapped. Whitman frowned. Let's not assume she snapped yet. What else do we know about Linda? The deputy scratched his head. Small-town sweetheart. Married Philip when she was 22. Known for her charity work. Quiet. Church-going. No criminal history. Whitman smirked grimly. It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? She moved toward the kitchen, where another deputy stood guard over a bloodied revolver in an evidence bag. This the weapon? Yes, ma'am. Registered to Linda Moore, the deputy confirmed. Whitman examined the weapon without touching it. It was a Smith & Wesson .38 Special, a reliable old-fashioned revolver. 6 shots fired, Whitman noted. 3 hit their targets, Philip, Grace, and David. What about the other 3? Bullet holes in the walls, detective. Looks like wild shots during the commotion, the deputy explained. Whitman nodded, her mind working through the sequence. Linda claimed betrayal. She shot her husband, her daughter, and injured her son. But why? What could drive a woman from a seemingly perfect family to commit such a gruesome act? As Whitman stepped out onto the porch, she spotted Sheriff Blake Larson leaning against his cruiser. His broad face was tired, and the lines around his eyes seemed deeper than usual. Detective, he greeted her with a nod. Welcome to the circus. It's all folks are talking about. Small towns always talk, Whitman replied. Tell me, Sheriff, what's your take on Linda Moore? Larson rubbed his jaw. Linda? Hell, I've known her for years. Never would have thought she had it in her to hurt a fly, let alone her own family. But people do crazy things when their worlds fall apart. And what's her world? Whitman asked, watching his expression carefully. Larson hesitated. There were rumors, he admitted finally, about the preacher, about his behavior. Folks say he wasn't as holy as he liked to appear on Sunday mornings. Whitman raised an eyebrow. With women in the congregation, married women. It wasn't public knowledge, but it wasn't exactly a secret either. Whitman tucked that piece of information into her mental file. A pastor sleeping around could certainly spark marital tensions, but murder? There had to be more. Anything else? She pressed. Larson sighed. Linda's been acting strange for months. Folks said she was withdrawn, paranoid. She started skipping church, which was odd. Philip was furious about it, but no one knew why she stopped coming. Whitman's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was the forensic team's preliminary report. She excused herself and stepped aside to read it. The findings were routine. Blood spatter consistent with close-range gunshots, no signs of forced entry, and fingerprints on the revolver matching Linda's. But one detail caught her attention. A trace of lipstick smudged on Philip's collar. Bright red. Whitman frowned. Linda didn't wear red lipstick. Back at the station, Whitman interviewed Linda Moore. The woman sat on the other side of the table, her hands trembling as she clutched a styrofoam cup of water. Her once perfectly styled blonde hair was disheveled, her eyes hollow. Mrs. Moore, Whitman began softly, I'm here to help uncover the truth. But I need you to tell me everything, no matter how painful it is. Linda didn't look up. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They betrayed me. They ruined everything. Who betrayed you? Whitman pressed. My husband, Linda spat the word like poison. He wasn't the man people thought he was. And Grace knew. Whitman leaned forward. What did Grace know, Linda? Tears streamed down Linda's face. She saw him with with another woman. I didn't believe her at first, but then I found them. Linda's voice cracked, and she broke into uncontrollable sobs. Whitman handed her a tissue but said nothing, letting the woman's words hang in the air. Another woman, Grace knew. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but Whitman couldn't shake the feeling that the picture was far more sinister than infidelity alone. As Linda calmed down, Whitman asked her one final question. "What happened that night, Linda? Why did you shoot?" Linda's eyes were red and swollen as she met Whitman's gaze. "Because they were going to destroy us. My family. I had to stop them." Whitman left the interview room with more questions than answers. What had Linda truly discovered about her husband? What had Grace seen that cost her life? And why did Linda believe her family was beyond saving? This wasn't just about a cheating preacher. Something darker was buried beneath the surface of the Moore family, and Whitman was determined to dig it up. Detective Claire Whitman returned to the Moore residence the following morning, this time with the forensic team in full swing. The bright Texas sun did little to warm the chilling atmosphere around the house. Yellow police tape flapped gently in the breeze, marking the home as a crime scene. Inside, the evidence techs were busy taking measurements, collecting fibers, and snapping photos. Whitman moved methodically, retracing the steps of the tragedy. She needed to know the truth, and every detail mattered. "Detective," called one of the techs, a young man named Connor. "You're going to want to see this." Whitman followed him to the master bedroom, where he pointed to the dresser. Nestled between neatly folded stacks of clothing was a red lipstick tube. She stared at it, her mind immediately going back to the forensic report, the same shade as the smear found on Philip Moore's collar. "That's not Linda's, is it?" Connor asked, though they both already knew the answer. Whitman shook her head. "Bag it and tag it." Connor nodded, carefully placing the lipstick in an evidence bag. Whitman's eyes swept across the room. It was clean, almost sterile. The bed was neatly made, the floors spotless, and the walls adorned with framed Bible verses. The only thing out of place was the lipstick, a splash of color in an otherwise orderly space. "Let's check the closets," Whitman said, opening the large sliding doors. Inside, Philip Moore's wardrobe was organized to perfection. Starched white shirts hung in a row, each one ironed to military precision. But something caught Whitman's attention, a shoebox on the top shelf, tucked behind a stack of sweaters. "Hand me those gloves," she said to Connor. Slipping on the gloves, Whitman pulled down the box and opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Each one featured Philip Moore in compromising positions with various women, none of whom were Linda. Some were taken in hotel rooms, others in cars, and a few even in the church office. Whitman's stomach churned. These weren't just rumors of infidelity, they were proof. But who took these photos? And why were they hidden in the house? "Jesus," Connor muttered, peering over her shoulder. This guy was bold. Whitman didn't respond. She flipped through the pictures, looking for patterns. In the last few, Philip wasn't alone. A young woman appeared in multiple shots, a striking redhead, likely in her 20s. She was wearing a familiar shade of lipstick. "Find out who she is," Whitman ordered, handing the photos to Connor. Later that day, Whitman paid a visit to the hospital, where David Moore was recovering. The 18-year-old had undergone surgery for his shoulder wound and was sedated but conscious. Whitman found him in a small room, staring blankly at the muted TV mounted on the wall. "David," she began gently, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "I'm Detective Whitman. I'm here to help figure out what happened to your family." David turned to her, his face pale and gaunt. "What's there to figure out? Mom shot us. That's all there is. Your mom said she felt betrayed, that something happened before she snapped," Whitman pressed. "Do you know what she meant?" David hesitated, his eyes darting away. I don't know." Whitman leaned forward, lowering her voice. "David, I've seen families fall apart before. I know it's hard to talk about, but I need to know the truth. What was going on in your house?" Tears welled in David's eyes. "It wasn't perfect, okay? Dad, he wasn't who everyone thought he was. Mom knew. Grace knew. Even I knew. But we couldn't do anything about it." "What did Grace know?" Whitman asked, her tone firm but kind. David swallowed hard. She saw Dad with someone else, a woman, a few weeks ago. She told Mom, and everything went downhill from there. Mom wouldn't talk to Dad. She started locking herself in her room, crying all the time. Did Grace confront your dad? David nodded slowly. Yeah, she yelled at him one night, said he was ruining our family, but he just brushed her off like it didn't matter. That's who he was, always acting like he was above everyone else. Whitman studied David carefully. What about the night of the shooting? What happened? David's expression darkened. We were arguing. Mom and Dad were screaming at each other in the living room. Grace tried to step in, but Mom lost it. She grabbed the gun and started shooting. I tried to stop her, but he trailed off, tears streaming down his face. Whitman didn't press him further. His account matched Linda's confession, but it still felt incomplete. Something was missing, and she needed to find it. The next morning, Whitman received a call from Connor. He'd identified the redhead in the photographs. Her name was Emily Carter, a 26-year-old waitress at a nearby diner. Whitman wasted no time tracking her down. Emily was working the lunch shift at Cindy's diner when Whitman walked in. The young woman froze when she saw the detective approach. Emily Carter? Whitman asked, showing her badge. Emily nodded nervously. Yeah, is something wrong? Can we talk privately? Reluctantly, Emily led Whitman to a back booth. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a glass of water. Emily, I'm investigating the deaths of Philip and Grace Moore, Whitman began. I have reason to believe you knew Philip personally. Emily's face turned white. I don't know what you're talking about. Whitman slid one of the photos across the table. It was Emily and Philip laughing together in what appeared to be a motel room. Emily's shoulders slumped. Okay, fine. I knew him. But I didn't have anything to do with what happened. How long were you involved with him? About a year. Emily admitted, her voice shaking. He told me he was unhappy at home, that his wife didn't love him anymore. Whitman's jaw tightened. Did you know about the other women? Emily's eyes widened. What other women? He told me I was the only one. Whitman sighed. Another lie from the preacher. Emily, she said, her voice firm. I need to know everything you know about Philip Moore. Lives are depending on it. Detective Claire Whitman left Cindy's diner with more questions than answers. Emily Carter had revealed little about Philip Moore beyond their affair. She seemed genuinely shocked to hear of the other women, and her heartbreak was clear. Still, Whitman couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was hiding something. Back at the station, Whitman sat at her desk, reviewing the mounting evidence. The photographs, the lipstick, and David's admission about the family arguments painted a picture of a fractured home. But Linda's claim of betrayal still nagged at her. There was more to this story. As she sipped her coffee, Whitman's phone buzzed. It was a call from Dr. Reynolds, the psychologist who had been working with Grace Moore at the school for children with disabilities. Detective Whitman, the voice on the other end greeted. I heard about Grace. I'm so sorry for your loss. Thank you, Doctor. Reynolds, Whitman replied. I was hoping you could help me understand Grace's state of mind in the weeks leading up to the incident. Dr. Reynolds sighed. Grace was struggling. She loved her family, but she often spoke about tension at home. She was particularly worried about her mother. She said Linda was acting erratically, crying, yelling, and staying in her room for hours at a time. Did she mention her father? Whitman asked. Yes, Dr. Reynolds said hesitantly. Grace was conflicted about him. She looked up to him as a preacher, but felt he wasn't being honest with her mother. She hinted at seeing him with someone else, though she didn't go into detail. Whitman leaned forward in her chair. Did Grace ever express fear of her parents? Dr. Reynolds paused. Not fear, exactly, but she did say she felt stuck, like she was caught in the middle of their problems. She wanted to protect her mom, but she didn't know how. Whitman hung up, her mind racing. Grace had seen something or someone that shattered her image of her father. It was a thread worth pulling. She turned her attention to the financial records her team had pulled on Philip Moore. For a preacher, his bank accounts were unusually active. Regular deposits from the church were expected, but there were also significant withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time. often labeled as business expenses. Digging deeper, Whitman found a pattern. The withdrawals corresponded with stays at upscale hotels around Texas. She cross-referenced the dates with the photos in the shoebox. Every hotel room matched one of the locations in the pictures. Whitman picked up the phone and called Emily Carter again. "Emily, it's Detective Whitman. I have a few more questions about Philip Moore." Emily groaned. "I told you everything I know." "Not everything," Whitman pressed. "You traveled with him, didn't you? Stayed in hotels together?" There was a long pause before Emily answered. "Yeah. He said he needed to get away sometimes. That his wife didn't understand him. Did he ever mention where the money came from?" Emily hesitated. "He said it was church money, that the congregation trusted him to use it wisely." Whitman's grip tightened on the phone. Embezzlement. The preacher wasn't just a philanderer, he was a thief. That evening, Whitman returned to the Moore residence, this time to search Philip's office. It was a small, cluttered room tucked away at the back of the house. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with religious texts and sermons. But Whitman wasn't interested in the books. She focused on the desk. Inside the top drawer, she found a ledger. At first glance, it appeared to be a record of church donations. But as Whitman flipped through it, discrepancies jumped out. Donations were listed as higher than the amounts recorded in the church's bank statements. She took the ledger to the station for analysis, calling in a financial expert to review it. "Detective," said Marcus, the analyst, a few hours later, "you were right. This ledger shows inflated donation amounts. Philip Moore was skimming money off the top." Whitman's chest tightened. Philip's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was criminal. The next morning, Whitman paid a visit to First Baptist Church, where Philip Moore had been the head preacher for over a decade. She met with the church's treasurer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Caldwell. "I can't believe you're suggesting Philip stole from the church," Mrs. Caldwell said, clutching her pearls. "I don't want to believe it either," Whitman replied. "But the evidence is clear. He was withdrawing large sums of money and spending it on personal trips." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes brimmed with tears. "He always seemed so righteous. I trusted him." "Do you know if anyone else was involved?" Whitman asked. Mrs. Caldwell shook her head. "Not that I am aware of, but I did notice he started locking his office at the church a few months ago. Said it was to protect sensitive documents." Whitman's instincts flared. "I'll need access to that office." Back at the church, Whitman searched Philip's locked office. She found more incriminating evidence: receipts for luxury items, hotel bookings, and even a second phone. The phone was the key. It contained dozens of text messages and photos, including conversations with multiple women. One thread, however, stood out. It was with someone listed only as L. The messages were heated, full of accusations and threats. Whoever L was, they knew about Philip's infidelity and were furious. The last message, sent the day before the shooting, read, "You'll regret everything you've done. I promise." Whitman stared at the screen, her mind racing. Linda had motive, but could she have sent this message? Or was there another player in this tangled web? Detective Claire Whitman sat in her office, staring at the message from Philip Moore's hidden phone. The words, "You'll regret everything you've done. I promise," echoed in her mind. If L was Linda Moore, the wife's emotional breakdown after years of infidelity and betrayal now had a potential breaking point. But could this explain a murder? Whitman decided to dig deeper into Linda's life in the weeks before the tragedy. She pulled phone records, emails, and social media activity to see if Linda had shown any warning signs. What she found surprised her. Linda had been communicating with a divorce attorney, a fact that hadn't come up during Whitman's initial interview. The email thread revealed a woman desperate for a way out. Linda had written, "I can't take this anymore. He's been lying to me for years. I don't want to ruin Grace and David's lives, but I need to leave." The date of the email was 5 days before the murders. Whitman met with Linda's attorney, Sarah Pollard, who reluctantly agreed to talk. "Linda was devastated when she came to me," Pollard explained. "She felt trapped. Philip controlled everything: her finances, her social life, even her self-esteem." "Did she ever mention feeling unsafe?" Whitman asked. Pollard nodded. "She said she was afraid of how Philip might react if she left. But she wasn't afraid for herself. She was more worried about Grace. She thought Philip might try to take her away. Whitman's brow furrowed. Why would she think that? Pollard hesitated. Grace had seen things, heard arguments between Philip and the other women. Linda thought Philip might use Grace's disability to make her look like an unfit mother. Whitman left the meeting with a clearer picture of Linda's mental state. She wasn't just angry, she was terrified and desperate. Later that day, Whitman received a call from forensics. The lab had finished analyzing the gun used in the murders. "Detective, we found something unusual," the tech said. "The fingerprints on the gun aren't just Linda's. There's a partial print from someone else, Grace Moore." Whitman froze. "Grace?" "Yes. It's faint, but it's there. It looks like she may have handled the gun before the shooting." Whitman's mind raced. Why would Grace have touched the weapon? Was it possible she had been involved, or was she just a tragic bystander? Determined to get answers, Whitman revisited the Moore home. She asked Linda for another interview, this time focusing on Grace. "Grace loved her father," Linda said, her voice trembling. "But she wasn't blind. She saw how he treated me. She knew about the other women." "Did she ever talk about it with you?" Whitman asked. "Not directly," Linda admitted, "but she left me notes sometimes. Little messages telling me to be strong, to fight back. I think she felt guilty, like it was her fault we were struggling." "Did she ever mention the gun?" Linda's eyes widened. Why? What are you saying?" Whitman chose her words carefully. "The forensics team found Grace's fingerprints on the weapon. It could mean she handled it before the shooting." Linda broke into sobs. She wouldn't. Grace couldn't." Whitman reached out a comforting hand. "I'm not saying she pulled the trigger, but it's possible she knew more about what was going on than you realized." Back at the station, Whitman pieced together the timeline again. Grace's involvement added a new layer of complexity. What if she had tried to intervene? Or worse, what if she had been used as a pawn in her parents' fight? To find out, Whitman called David Moore back for another interview. "David," she began gently, "I need you to tell me everything you remember from that night. Even the small details could help." David looked down, his hands fidgeting. "I already told you everything. I know, but we found Grace's fingerprints on the gun. Do you know how they got there?" David's face turned pale. I didn't think it mattered. Grace found the gun a few days before everything happened. She showed it to me, said she was scared." "Scared of what?" "Of Dad," David whispered. "She said he was going to hurt Mom. She didn't say how, but she was sure. She thought if she had the gun, she could protect Mom." Whitman leaned forward. "Did you tell anyone about this?" David shook his head. "I didn't think she'd actually use it. I thought she was just upset." Whitman's head spun as she processed David's revelation. Grace had feared her father enough to take drastic measures, but had Linda known about it? Whitman checked the messages on Philip's secret phone again. The messages from Elle took on new significance. Was it possible Grace had sent them, posing as Linda? She took the phone to the tech team for analysis. Hours later, they confirmed her suspicion. The messages from Elle had been sent from Grace's tablet. Whitman's heart sank. Grace had been more involved than anyone realized. The investigation was coming to a head. Whitman now had to consider the unthinkable. Was Grace's death a tragic accident, or had her attempt to protect her mother spiraled out of control? Detective Claire Whitman knew the case was nearing its climax. The revelation that Grace had sent the threatening messages and her involvement with the gun painted a picture of a teenager grappling with chaos far beyond her ability to handle. But how had the events escalated to murder? Whitman revisited the crime scene notes in the timeline, scrutinizing every detail. There were gaps, moments unaccounted for between Linda's claims and David's statements. The forensics team had already established that Grace touched the weapon, but the final trajectory of events still didn't make sense. Whitman paid another visit to Linda Moore in jail. She brought a copy of the threatening messages. "Linda," Whitman said, sliding the papers across the table, "did you send these to Philip?" Linda looked at the papers, confusion etched across her face. "I never sent those. Where did you find them?" They were on Philip's secret phone, but they weren't from you. They were sent from Grace's tablet. Linda's hands trembled as she held the papers. Grace? She wrote these? It appears so, Whitman said. She must have discovered Philip's affairs and decided to scare him. But what I don't understand is how that led to the events of that night. Tears streamed down Linda's face. I didn't know. I had no idea she felt this way. Whitman leaned in. I need you to think carefully. Did Grace say or do anything unusual in the days leading up to the shooting? Linda hesitated. She was quieter than usual. She stayed in her room a lot. I thought she was just upset about the arguments between Philip and me. I didn't realize. Her voice trailed off, and Whitman saw the realization dawn on her face. Back at the station, Whitman dug deeper into Grace's tablet. She found a draft note that had never been sent. It read, Mom doesn't see it, but I know what Dad's doing. He lies and he hurts her. I have to do something before it's too late. I have to protect her. The note was dated 2 days before the murders. Whitman also uncovered a search history that confirmed Grace had looked up how to handle a firearm. The pieces were falling into place, but they painted a deeply tragic picture. Grace had taken it upon herself to intervene in her parents' crumbling marriage. But had it cost her her life? Whitman received another call from the forensics team that evening. They had analyzed the bullet trajectories and determined something critical. Grace had not been shot at close range. The angle and distance suggest she was across the room when she was hit, the technician explained. Whitman frowned. That doesn't align with Linda's confession. She claimed she shot Grace by accident in a struggle over the gun. That's impossible, the technician said. Grace couldn't have been holding the gun when she was shot. The new evidence forced Whitman to confront Linda with the inconsistencies. Linda, the forensic report contradicts your story, Whitman said during their next meeting. Grace wasn't close enough to be part of a struggle. Can you explain that? Linda looked down, her hands twisting nervously. I thought it would be easier this way. Easier? Whitman pressed. Linda took a deep breath. Grace found the gun in Philip's office. She told me she wanted to protect me. I tried to take it away from her, but she wouldn't let me. I didn't think she'd actually do anything with it, but then that night, everything fell apart. Tell me what happened, Whitman urged. Linda closed her eyes, her voice breaking. Philip came home late. He smelled like perfume. Not mine. I confronted him. We screamed at each other, and then Grace came downstairs holding the gun. She was shaking, crying, saying she wanted him to stop hurting me. Linda's voice grew quieter. Philip tried to talk her down, but she wouldn't listen. He lunged for the gun, and it went off. He fell, and then Grace just froze. She dropped the gun, and I picked it up. I didn't even think. I was so angry, so hurt. Whitman's stomach turned as Linda broke down into sobs. You shot her, Whitman finished. Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to. I lost control. Linda's confession clarified the sequence of events. Grace had tried to defend her mother, but her inexperience and fear had led to a tragic mistake. Linda's own rage had turned that mistake into a nightmare. The next step was to cross-check Linda's confession with the evidence. Ballistic reports confirmed that the gun had been fired twice, once during the struggle between Philip and Grace, and again when Linda shot Grace. Whitman also revisited David's account. He confirmed hearing the first shot followed by screaming, then a second shot after a brief silence. By the end of the day, Whitman had the full story. Grace had taken the gun to protect her mother, threatening Philip during an argument. Philip's attempt to disarm her led to his accidental shooting. The trial of Linda Moore became the talk of the small Texas town. The courtroom was packed with journalists, neighbors, and members of Philip Moore's congregation. The tragic details of the case, an open marriage, a mentally disabled teenager trying to shield her mother, and the explosive end to years of tension, captivated everyone. Detective Claire Whitman took the stand as the prosecution's star witness, presenting the evidence that had unraveled the harrowing sequence of events. She testified calmly and methodically, laying out how the forensic evidence, Grace's digital trail, and Linda's confession tied together. The prosecutor, Rachel Carter, painted Linda Moore as a woman pushed to her breaking point. Years of betrayal and manipulation drove this woman to unspeakable acts, Carter declared. But this is not a justification for murder. Linda Moore had a choice, and she made the wrong one. The defense attorney, Mark Leland, argued that Linda's actions were those of a desperate mother and not premeditated. My client was emotionally abused, gaslit, and left powerless for years, Leland said. On that night, she snapped. This wasn't murder. It was the tragic result of a toxic, volatile situation. Throughout the trial, Linda sat in silence, her face pale and her hands trembling. She refused to look at the crime scene photos when they were shown, breaking into quiet sobs when the jury saw images of Grace. David Moore, now the only surviving child, testified for both the prosecution and the defense. His testimony was heart-wrenching. "My mom wasn't a bad person," he said, his voice trembling. "She just couldn't handle everything that was happening. But Grace didn't deserve this." As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury faced an impossible decision. Linda's actions were inexcusable, but her circumstances evoked sympathy. The prosecution argued for a sentence that reflected the gravity of her crimes, while the defense pleaded for leniency, citing Linda's emotional and psychological state. Detective Whitman watched the proceedings with mixed emotions. She had spent weeks piecing together the truth, and now she wondered if the full weight of justice could ever be applied to such a complicated case. Grace's death had left scars that would never heal, and the town was left to grapple with the fallout of its beloved preacher's secret life. The jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching a verdict. Linda Moore was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge acknowledged the mitigating circumstances of emotional abuse, but emphasized that her actions had taken 2 lives, her daughter's and her husband's, and irreparably harmed her family. After the trial, Whitman visited David to check on him. "I don't know what to do now," he admitted. "I feel like I've lost everything." "You haven't," Whitman said gently. "You're still here, and you still have a chance to make a life for yourself. Grace wouldn't want you to give up." David nodded, though his eyes were clouded with pain. "I'll try." Months later, Whitman stood at Grace and Philip's graves, lost in thought. This case had been one of the hardest of her career, not because of the evidence, but because of the profound loss at its center. A young girl had tried to save her family, and in the end, she had paid the ultimate price. As Whitman turned to leave, she whispered a promise to Grace. "Your story won't be forgotten." She knew she couldn't bring back the lives lost, but she hoped that by telling the story, through her investigation, through the trial, through the lessons learned, she could honor Grace's memory and prevent another tragedy like this from happening again.